A lonely widow was ready to give up, until one knock changed everything forever. The winter of 1887 had been the cruelest Eleanor Dawson had ever known. She stood at the frosted window of her small cabin, watching the snow fall in thick white curtains across the Montana prairie. Her breath fogged the glass as she pressed her forehead against its cold surface, trying to remember the last time she had felt truly warm. 3 years ago, her husband Daniel had been alive. 3 years ago, this cabin had been filled with laughter, with the smell of fresh bread baking, with plans for the future they would build together on this unforgiving land. Now there was only silence, broken occasionally by the howling wind that found its way through every crack in the walls. Eleanor pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders and turned away from the window. The cabin felt smaller every day, the walls closing in around her grief like a tomb. She had sold most of their possessions over the past year, just to survive. The furniture Daniel had built with his own hands, going piece by piece to neighbors and passing traders. All that remained was a small table, 2 chairs, and the bed where she slept alone every night, reaching for a man who would never be there again. Christmas was 3 days away, and Eleanor had nothing. No food in the cupboard except a handful of dried beans. No firewood except what she could gather from the nearby grove. No family to share the holiday with. No friends close enough to care. She was 32 years old, and she felt ancient, worn down by loss and loneliness, until she barely recognized herself in the small mirror that hung beside the door. She had thought about leaving, about packing what little remained, and heading back east to whatever distant relatives might still remember her name. But something kept her here, rooted to this frozen patch of earth, where Daniel was buried beneath a simple wooden cross. Leaving felt like abandoning him, like admitting that their dreams had died with him on that terrible day when his horse had stumbled and thrown him against the rocks. The knock at her door came so unexpectedly that Eleanor nearly cried out in surprise. No one visited her cabin anymore. The other homesteaders had their own struggles, their own families to tend to, and she had become invisible to them. Just another failed settler waiting to be swallowed by the endless prairie. She crossed to the door and opened it cautiously, peering out into the swirling snow. A man stood on her porch, tall and broad-shouldered, his face half hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, dusted with white. Behind him, she could see a large horse laden with supplies, standing patiently, despite the bitter cold. The man removed his hat, revealing a face weathered by years of sun and wind, with deep brown eyes that seemed to hold both kindness and sorrow in equal measure. He looked to be perhaps 40, with streaks of gray at his temples and a jawline shadowed by several days of stubble. "Pardon the intrusion, ma'am," he said, his voice low and rough. "Name's Samuel Holden. I own the ranch about 15 miles north of here. I was making my way back home when this storm caught me by surprise. Wondered if I might take shelter in your barn until it passes." Eleanor hesitated. She had learned to be cautious around strangers, had heard stories of women alone being taken advantage of by men with bad intentions. But there was something in this man's eyes, something gentle and respectful, that made her believe he meant no harm. "The barn roof collapsed last spring," she said quietly. "I haven't had the means to repair it." Samuel Holden nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I see. Well, I won't impose on you then. I'll find somewhere else to wait out the weather." He turned to go, and Eleanor found herself calling out before she could stop herself. "Wait." He turned back, snow already beginning to accumulate on his shoulders again. "You can come inside," she said. "I don't have much to offer, but it's warm enough by the stove, and I couldn't live with myself if I sent a man back into that storm." Samuel studied her face for a long moment, then nodded gratefully. "I appreciate your kindness, ma'am. Let me secure my horse under that overhang there, and I'll be right in." Eleanor watched him lead his horse to the sheltered side of the cabin, where what remained of Daniel's workshop provided some protection from the wind. Then, she hurried inside to prepare for her unexpected guest, suddenly conscious of how bare and pitiful her home must appear. When Samuel entered a few minutes later, he carried 2 large saddlebags over his shoulder. He stamped the snow from his boots and looked around the cabin with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite read. "I brought some supplies from town," he said, setting the bags on her table. "Fresh bread, some cured ham, coffee, sugar. I'd be honored if you'd share them with me while I wait out the storm." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes and turned away quickly, not wanting this stranger to see her weakness. It had been so long since anyone had shown her any kindness, since she had tasted anything other than bland beans and the occasional rabbit she managed to trap. "That's very generous of you, Mr. Holden," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, call me Samuel." He moved to the stove and began building up the fire without being asked, as if he could sense how cold she had been, how she had been rationing her meager supply of firewood. "And it's not generosity, it's gratitude for your hospitality." They shared a meal that evening, simple but more substantial than anything Eleanor had eaten in months. Samuel talked easily, telling her about his ranch, about the cattle he raised, and the challenges of surviving another harsh Montana winter. He had a way of speaking that put her at ease, never prying into her circumstances, never making her feel judged for the obvious poverty of her surroundings. As the night deepened and the storm continued to rage outside, Eleanor found herself telling him things she hadn't spoken aloud in years. She told him about Daniel, about how they had met at a church social in Missouri, and fallen in love over shared dreams of building a life in the West. She told him about the good years, the struggle years, and finally the terrible morning when she had found Daniel's broken body beside the creek. Samuel listened with a stillness that made her feel truly heard for the first time since her husband's death. When she finished, tears streaming down her face, he reached across the table and took her hand in his. "My wife passed 5 years ago," he said quietly. "Cholera took her during the outbreak of '82. For a long time, I didn't think I'd survive the grief. Some days I still wonder if I really did, or if what's left of me is just going through the motions of living." Eleanor looked into his eyes and saw her own pain reflected back at her. "How do you keep going?" she asked. "1 day at a time," he said. "Sometimes 1 hour at a time," he said. "Sometimes 1 hour at a time. And I remind myself that she would have wanted me to live, not just exist. I haven't always been good at honoring that, but I try." The storm lasted 2 more days, and during that time something shifted between the Mem Samuel insisted on splitting firewood from the fallen branches around the property. He repaired the broken hinge on her door that had been letting in drafts for months. He helped her secure the windows against the wind with strips of cloth from his own spare shirt. Eleanor found herself watching him work, noticing the way he moved with quiet efficiency, the way he handled every task with care and attention. She noticed the way he smiled when she brought him coffee, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed at something she said. She noticed, and she felt something stir in her heart that she had thought was dead forever. On the morning of Christmas Eve, the storm finally broke. Bright winter sunshine flooded through the windows, making the snow-covered world outside sparkle like a field of diamonds. Samuel gathered his belongings slowly, his movements heavy with reluctance. "I should get back to the ranch," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "The hands will be wondering what happened to me." Eleanor nodded, feeling the warmth drain from the cabin already, even though he hadn't yet stepped through the door. "Of course. You've been very kind, Samuel. I don't know how to thank you." He put on his hat and turned to face her, his expression troubled. "Eleanor, I've been thinking about you being out here alone, with nothing to eat, and winter not even half over." He paused, seeming to wrestle with his next words. My ranch house is big, too big for just me. I have room, and I have plenty. I'd like to help you if you'd let me. I couldn't impose like that, Eleanor said quickly, even as her heart clenched at the thought of him leaving. It wouldn't be an imposition. Samuel took a step closer, his voice dropping low. These past 2 days, talking with you, being near you, I've felt something I haven't felt in a very long time. I'm not asking for an hand, bother way she would become everything in return. I'm just asking you to let me help you survive this winter. Come spring, if you want to go your own way, I won't stop you. But please don't stay here alone with nothing. Not when I have so much to share. Eleanor looked around the cabin, at the bare walls and empty cupboards, at the life that had slowly diminished until there was almost nothing left. Then she looked at Samuel, at the hope and fear warring in his brown eyes, at the hand he held out to her. All right, she whispered. I'll come with you. The ranch house was everything Samuel had described, and more. It was warm and solid, with plenty of food in the cellar, and firewood stacked high against the winter cold. His ranch hands, a weathered old cowboy named Pete, and 2 younger men barely out of their teens, welcomed her without question, treating her with respect and deference. Christmas Day arrived in a flurry of activity. Samuel had somehow managed to secure a small tree from a traveling merchant weeks earlier, and Eleanor found herself helping to decorate it with ribbons and bits of colored paper. They shared a dinner of roast goose and vegetables from the root cellar, with apple pie that Samuel admitted he had bought from the baker in town because his own cooking skills were limited. That evening, they sat together by the fire while the ranch hands played cards in the bunkhouse. The tree glittered in the lamplight, and outside the window, the moon cast long silver shadows across the snow. I never thought I'd celebrate another Christmas, Eleanor said softly. Not really celebrate, I mean. Not feel the joy of it again. Samuel reached over and took her hand, a gesture that had become familiar over the past few days, but still sent warmth flooding through her. Neither did I. But here we are, she agreed, and smiled at him. The winter passed slowly but sweetly. Eleanor found ways to make herself useful around the ranch, cooking meals and mending clothes, and keeping the house in order. She discovered a talent for managing accounts that Samuel gratefully turned over to her. Gradually, the hollow feeling in her chest began to fill with something new, something that felt terrifyingly like hope. Spring came late that year, melting the snow in patches and filling the creek with rushing water. The calves were born, and Eleanor helped where she could, marveling at the tiny new lives emerging into the warming world. She realized one morning, as she stood watching the sunrise over the greening prairie, that she was happy. Not just surviving, but actually happy. Samuel found her there, wrapped in a blanket against the lingering chill, and stood beside her without speaking. After a while, he cleared his throat. Spring's here, he said unnecessarily. Yes, it is. When we first came here, I told you that come spring, you could go your own way if you wanted. He paused, and she could hear the tension in his voice. Is that what you want, Eleanor? She turned to face him, this man who had appeared out of a snowstorm and changed everything. His face was carefully blank, but she could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear she had seen on Christmas Eve when he had asked her to come with him. No, she said simply, that's not what I want. The relief that flooded his features made her heart ache with tenderness. What do you want? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. Eleanor reached up and touched his face, feeling the roughness of his stubble beneath her palm. I want to stay. I want to build a life here with you if you'll have me. I want to stop being alone, and I want to stop being alone, and I want to stop being afraid of loving someone again. Samuel covered her hand with his own, pressing it against his cheek. I love you, Eleanor. I've loved you since that first night sitting in your kitchen watching you come back to life. I was afraid to say it, afraid of pushing you away. Say it again, she whispered. I love you. She rose on her toes and kissed him, soft and tentative at first, then deeper as he wrapped his arms around her and pulled her close. The sun rose higher, warming their faces, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark began to sing. They were married in June. In a small ceremony in the town church, with the ranch hands and a few neighbors as witnesses, Eleanor wore a blue dress that Samuel had ordered from the catalog in Denver, and she carried wildflowers picked from the prairie that morning. As they rode back to the ranch together, her hand clasped in his, Eleanor thought about that lonely widow who had stood at her frosted window, 3 years of grief behind her, and nothing but emptiness ahead. She thought about the unexpected knock at the door, the stranger with kind brown eyes, who had asked for nothing but shelter and given her everything. Life on the frontier remained hard. There were still harsh winters and difficult seasons, still losses to bear and challenges to overcome. But Eleanor never faced them alone again. She had Samuel beside her, steady and strong. And in time she had children, 2 daughters and a son, who filled the ranch house with laughter and love. Years later, when her hair had turned gray and her hands were weathered from decades of work, Eleanor would tell her grandchildren the story of that Christmas when she had nothing, and a stranger had appeared out of the storm to save her. She told them about love that arrives when you least expect it, about second chances and the courage it takes to open your heart after it has been broken. And every Christmas Eve, no matter how busy the ranch had become, she and Samuel would sit together by the fire, holding hands just as Ted I had that first winter, grateful for the storm that had brought them together and the love that had kept them there.